when the Soviet Union collapsed, there was an agreement which was reached between Gorbachev and the US president that there would be no expansion of NATO to Eastern Europe beyond its current boundaries. As a matter of fact, there is no reason for an organization like NATO to exist at all after the collapse of the Soviet Union, because the reason why NATO was supposed to exist, it's supposed in principle to be a defensive organization, and it was supposed to defend Europe against what was considered to be potential Soviet aggression. So when the Soviet Union collapsed, ideally NATO should have been disbanded, because by their own professed arguments, the rationale for the existence of something like NATO had disappeared with the collapse of the Soviet Union. At any rate, there was an agreement which was reached with Gorbachev and the US President Clinton at that time, that there would be no further expansion of NATO eastwards. Now, that agreement was actually broken quite explicitly, and NATO started expanding eastwards to all the various countries, including countries that were formerly a part of the Soviet Union, that is Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and all this. Finally, when NATO started expanding and incorporating Ukraine, there was that was the last straw breaking the camel's back, because Ukraine is just very close to Russia, and that was not just in violation of the earlier agreement, but is something which posed a direct threat to the existence of Russia itself. As a matter of fact, this was made possible by a coup d'etat which the United States engineered in Ukraine. The moving spirit behind this coup d'etat was a lady called Victoria Nuland, who occupied an important position in the US State Department. And she not only directed the coup d'etat, but it was a CIA-sponsored coup d'etat, but what is more, she even named who should form the government that would be formed after the elected president Viktor Yanukovych had been overthrown. Viktor Yanukovych, who wanted to have a position which was neither anti-Russia nor alienating to the West, he wanted Ukraine to have a more or less certain neutral position, not be aligned with one or the other. He was overthrown, and of course, in his place, the government that was formed was one which actually was, the moving spirit behind it were actually people who were the descendants politically of those who had collaborated with the Nazis during the Second World War. So you had the Nazi era collaborators, and they infiltrated into the Ukraine army. They set up a thing called the Azov Battalion, and in other places in the Ukraine army, and they launched, the new government launched an attack on those areas in Ukraine which were peopled by Russian-speaking people. In other words, it was actually an internal attack on the Russian-speaking people. That war continued, and about 15,000 people had died in it when the Russians intervened. The Russian intervention itself was one which was motivated when an agreement, a peace agreement called the Minsk Agreement, that had been worked out between Ukraine and Russia collapsed. And with Germany and France being the mediators, had actually collapsed because the US and the UK objected to it. In fact, the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson flew to Kiev to tell Zelensky that don't sign this agreement. And therefore, there is no doubt that the Ukraine war is something which was more or less forced on Russia by US-led imperialism. And I think that is a war which they cannot win, but on the other hand, they don't wish to compromise. Every other day you hear of Putin making some peace proposal, including I saw in today's paper, but on the other hand, they don't want a peace there. The US imperialism doesn't want a peace there. They want to fight the Ukraine war to the last Ukrainian. Now, why are they doing this? I think one of the reasons, I mean, it's very difficult to know why they are doing it, but my own hypothesis would be that when the Soviet Union collapsed, they actually thought that they would be able to take over Russia and with its enormous natural resources. Russia is very rich. It has oil, of course, but what is more is very rich in natural gas and all kinds of minerals. It's an enormous country, and thought that they would actually have access to all of that with the collapse of the Soviet Union. As a matter of fact, when Boris Yeltsin was the president of Russia, it is said that he was always accompanied by 100 CIA men around him. Now, with Putin's coming, whatever one may think about Putin's own authoritarianism internally and so on, which of course is very much there, he is no leftist, he is no comrade. But on the other hand, with Putin's coming, at least what has happened is that there is a certain revival of the autonomy and spirit of independence in Russia. I mean, he got rid of the CIA control on the Russian polity and the American control on the Russian economy. And of course, he generally stood out for Russia's independence, Russia's own independence. And of course, he was more or less forced to intervene in Ukraine because of the Ukrainian war against those who are the minority regions, Donetsk and all those places. Now, this war is something which US-led imperialism cannot win. But on the other hand, they are still not willing to make a peace agreement, because of which there's a war which is really has the danger of escalating to a point it might actually even give rise to a third world war, because they are both nuclear armed. And if NATO sends in troops to Ukraine, which there is much talk in Western circles, if NATO sends troops to Ukraine, in that case Russia would technically have to declare that it is in war against NATO. And that being the case, hell would break loose. Now, that is as far as Ukraine is concerned. Now, on the other battlefront, which is Gaza, we know that Israel has been doing a settler colonial project there for a very long time. The settler colonial project basically means doing to the Palestinians what the European population had done in Canada, United States, Australia, and so on, get rid of the local inhabitants, put them into reservations, take over their land, and so on. Now, that's exactly what settler colonialism, I mean, Israeli settler colonialism is attempting to do, is actually doing in Gaza. Now, in fact, the 1948 Intifada actually drove Palestinians from their homes, and that was the first big episode of settler colonialism. After that, despite the fact that successive American presidents have committed themselves to preventing the settlement of Israelis on Palestinian territory, that is something which continues. Mind you, of the remaining Palestinian territory, that is something which continues, and therefore the whole idea is to drive Palestinians out. Now, against this, again, the whole Gaza situation, it is not just a war that Israel is launching against Hamas. It's actually a war to drive the Palestinians out of Gaza and take over that region. So you have the inflicting of a real genocide by the definition of the United Nations itself, which is happening in Gaza. And in this genocide, again, what Israel is doing is obviously helped by the United States and the US-led imperialism. In many countries on Europe, if you said that Israel is committing genocide, you'll be put in jail. In many countries in Europe, in fact, if you said anything about Israeli settler colonialism, you would be accused of being anti-Semitic, of doing anti-Semitism. Now, this is absolutely notorious because in many countries, and for instance, those political leaders, Jeremy Corbyn was Labour leader, and he was thrown out of the Labour Party because he supported the Palestinians. Similarly, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, the current leader of the French left, the NPF, New Popular Front, that has been formed, has been a consistent supporter of Palestine, but on the other hand, for forming the Popular Front, he has had to step back and in some sense reach some sort of an agreement with the socialists and others, which would actually prevent him from speaking out in favor of the Palestinians. So imperialism is putting pressure not only directly on the Palestinians, but imperialism is putting pressure against any political voice that actually supports the Palestinians in any part of the world. Against this, however, there has been a massive upsurge. There has been, as you know, student movements all over the United States. There have been massive demonstrations in London and in other countries of Europe, in Germany, all in support of the Palestinians. And what is more, it's a cause on which now much of the third world is actually united. You see, the duplicity of the Western-led imperialism is obvious from one very simple fact, that, okay, you want peace in Gaza, you want a solution to the Palestinian problem. Now, everybody swears by, including the United States, by a two-state solution. Even the Indian state accepts a two-state solution. Now, the first thing about a two-state solution then is to accept the Palestinian state. But on the other hand, every time the issue of Palestinian statehood comes up at the United Nations General Assembly, even though it's overwhelmingly voted and sent to the Security Council, in Security Council, the United States imposes a veto. In fact, even though they are a tiny minority in the General Assembly, in the Security Council, the US veto basically means the Palestinian statehood simply cannot come into being. So it is a duplicity where on the one hand you say we want peace, and we are in favor of a two-state solution, but on the other hand, every time the idea of forming a Palestinian state comes on the agenda, you veto it, and which is what happened last month in May, for instance. Now, against this, however, again, all over the world, there is an upsurge. Similarly, in Africa, there is an upsurge against imperialism, particularly in Western Africa. You see, it would surprise many Indian students that, you see, when India got independence, the British left. I mean, you had the Indian army, which was manned by Indians. But on the other hand, in many Western African countries, the French armies remain. In fact, in all these ex-colonies, they're actually French armies. And what is more, a very remarkable African leader from Burkina Faso called Thomas Sankara, who wanted French troops out, was actually overthrown in a coup d'etat and murdered. So the French have been keeping a stranglehold on their colonies despite formal decolonization. And they have tied these colonies into a common currency agreement called the CFA, that is, the African franc, which has a constant, exchange ratio with the French franc, because of which the monetary policy of all these countries, and therefore by implication fiscal and other economic policies, are all really controlled by France. So because of these currency arrangements, France gets an excuse to control the economic policies of its former colonies in West Africa. So but against that now, in West Africa, there is also an uprising. In many of the countries in West Africa, as you know, recently there has been a change of governments, and the new governments are determined to get French troops out. Let us see to what extent they succeed, but this is something which is again going to be another flashpoint, and this again implies an uprising against imperialism. Latin America's case is well known. You referred to the coup in Bolivia, but in Venezuela, Cuba, and now with Brazil and so on, there is an uprising against imperialism. It is said that in Pakistan, the coup or the overthrowing of Imran Khan was engineered by the Americans. That Imran Khan, everything said and done, was, at least in foreign policy, taking a position which was not exactly pro-American, and so they got rid of Imran Khan. That it was an American attempt at a coup d'etat. So the imperialism, on the one hand, is being challenged all over the globe in a manner which is quite unprecedented. But imperialism all over the globe is actually also fighting back in a manner extremely vicious that may actually send the world to a third world war. The setbacks to imperialism, certainly at the level of economics, are quite phenomenal because, for instance, they imposed these sanctions on Russia. They said nobody can buy Russian oil and natural gas. And what is more, they froze Russian assets held with the Western banks. Now that is something which goes against every norm of bourgeois legality. It had been first tried against Iran when long ago. The Iranian assets in Western banks were all frozen. And now the Russian assets are all frozen. So the idea was to destroy the ruble, deny Russia foreign exchange, in which case Russia would be forced to depreciate its currency, the ruble would collapse, and the slogan was reduce the ruble to rubble. But as a matter of fact, Russia did a smart thing. It said that anybody who buys Russian natural gas would have to pay for it in rubles, which basically meant that people had to get rubles to buy Russian natural gas, and that being the case, the value of ruble immediately after these sanctions were imposed actually shot up instead of going down. And even now, the value of the ruble, even though it has come down from the levels to which it had shot up, is certainly higher than what it was before the sanctions were imposed. So it's quite remarkable. And what is more, it is Europe which is facing a crisis because of the shortage of natural gas. And by now it is well known that to prevent the flow of natural gas from Russia to Europe at all, so that the Europeans don't reach a separate agreement with Russia, the US launched a covert operation to destroy the North Sea pipelines, which by now is well established was engineered by the CIA. So the point is that, as of now, there is unity as far as imperialism is concerned, notwithstanding the fact that it is now facing a real crisis. But in the face of this crisis, how long the unity would last is not very clear, because within Germany, for instance, which is the country where Russian natural gas was most needed, there is an enormous uprising. In fact, in Germany, like in all these countries, it is not only, it's a bit like what Lenin was talking about on the eve of the First World War. It is not only the conservative parties that are followers of imperialism, but even the social democratic parties, and including even many of the left parties. As a result, in Germany, the left party was actually split by a lady called Sarah Wagenknecht, who set up a new party, and now it seems her party is actually beginning to acquire a certain popularity. They had a meeting in Berlin for peace, which was attended by 1 million people. So everywhere you find that even though imperialism is in a crisis, imperialism is managing to retain a certain kind of agreement as of now, but this is likely to be threatened. This is likely to be subverted any time because it is imposing an extraordinarily heavy price as far as the working people are concerned, certainly all over Europe and even in the United States. Apparently, 61% of the population believes that what the country is doing in supporting Netanyahu in Gaza is wrong. So the majority of the world opinion is so aroused against imperialism at the moment in a manner which is unimaginable. I mean, I certainly have not seen, except during the Vietnam War, one has not really seen imperialism so isolated as it is at the moment. Of course, this isolation has to be taken advantage of, and struggles have to be launched against imperialism. But on the other hand, as I said, it is facing at the moment a real crisis. This is a crisis which arises because, in some sense, of an imperial overreach that they thought after the collapse of the Soviet Union that they can just march into every country, and obviously the resistance that they face is one which has brought them to this condition, a condition of crisis. Unfortunately, in India, somehow many of these facts are not necessarily well known, and other than the left, I mean other than maybe you people, there are not kind of mass demonstrations. As a matter of fact, a Pakistani leftist who lives in London remarked that all over the world, in every capital city, there has been massive demonstrations on the Palestinian issue, except in New Delhi. I mean, in New Delhi, I know that the left parties organize these demonstrations, but they are still very small. In other words, it's true that in India, awareness of this is really not as much as there. And what is more, I was told yesterday or day before that actually that one of the issues raised even within the rank and file of the left parties during the last elections is, why are we not attacking Hamas? Now, I think that is absolutely ridiculous. The UN Secretary General has said, that you cannot talk of the Hamas in the same breath as you're talking about Israeli aggression, because Hamas's aggression has to be seen in the context of decades of settler colonialism, which Israel has been indulging in the Palestinian state, I mean in the Palestinian region. So it is not a question of being equidistant. It is a question of locating a particular problem in its historical context. You cannot really take it out of the historical context, and the fact that this kind of question is being raised even in circles in Kerala is something which has to be resisted. I find it quite disturbing, and it actually shows, in a certain sense, the kind of influence that the Hindutva forces are acquiring. Because Israel, by the way, is at the moment, Israel is committed to supporting the current Israeli regime. Within Israel, there are very strong elements which want peace, which are opposed to what Israel is doing. But I'm talking about the Israeli government. The Israeli government is committed to supporting every fascist regime all over the world. In fact, they're actually supporting Meloni, they're supporting Modi, they're supporting every fascist regime all over the world. And they really, and they themselves are a fascist regime. So there is kind of, imperialism's aggression is supported by a fascist onslaught, which is led by which is led by Israel, and in that onslaught, the Indian government is very much a part, and I think we have to put pressure on the Indian government. Indian government also says we are committed to a two-state solution. And it must be said in the last UN General Assembly, they voted for the two-state, for the inclusion of Israel. But on the other hand, they are providing arms to Israel. At this very moment, even as Israel is engaged in a war of aggression against the Palestinian people, the Indian government is providing arms to Israel. So these are things that we have to really mobilize people against, and our anti-imperialist struggle gets merged with the struggle against the foreign policy of this fascist government of Modi. Thank you. I'll stop there.